On the 18th of September 2024, The Guardian reported that the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, asked for a portrait of James II to be removed from 11 Downing Street. It seems that she wishes to have more portraits of women on display. And this is the portrait which will go into the storage in the government art collection. In Oxford, there are 3 portraits of James II. The first is in the town hall. The second is in Christchurch, and the third in Campion Hall. And of course, there's also the statue of the King at University College. James perhaps deserves to be remembered in Oxford for all the wrong reasons. His relations with Oxford and Oxfordshire exemplify the misjudgments and headstrong character that lost him the throne. James's first contact with Oxford can be traced to 1642, when, as a 9-year-old boy, the university made him a Master of Arts during the siege of the city. 39 years later, after the Restoration, Oxford was regarded as a safe place to hold a meeting of Parliament, in fact, the last occasion on which Parliament met outside Westminster. It was an attempt to thwart those who wanted to pass a law excluding James from the succession to the throne. The repeated attempts in Parliament to exclude James from the throne were rooted in the idea that as a Catholic, he would endanger the Church of England. The exclusionists also feared that James properly believed that he had absolutist tendencies. As a Tory loyalist stronghold, it was thought that the atmosphere of Oxford would inhibit the exclusionists in Parliament. But the Commons elected the firebrand Welsh MP William Williams as Speaker, and within 7 days the exclusionist demands had been repeated, and the Oxford Parliament was prorogued. To show his fury, Charles II replaced the Duke of Monmouth as Chancellor. In 1683, James and his brother Charles survived an assassination attempt called the Rye House Plot. The exclusionists, who by now had gained the nickname of Whigs, were the hardcore plotters. The plan was to ambush Charles and James at Rye House in Hertfordshire, and here you can see a map of the area, and at the bottom the narrow passage is marked. This is in a part of the road where the road became narrow and was sunken, and the mounted lifeguards had to fall back. This would allow an assassination to take place relatively easily. Both brothers were to be killed, and Charles's illegitimate son, the Protestant Duke of Monmouth, was to be made king. The plot was foiled partly because Charles and James came back to London earlier than anticipated, and also because one of the plotters lost his nerve and turned informant. The response to the plot was a wave of revulsion and shock. Whig opponents were rounded up by the government and dozens were executed. Those who got away fled to Holland. Lord Lovelace, an Oxfordshire landowner, only just managed to avoid arrest for his role in the conspiracy. After the plot, James visited Oxford in triumph and was shown around Lincoln College by the rector. In Oxford, the horror at the assassination plot was met with this formal statement by the university's convocation: Judicium et Decretum Universitatis Oxoniensis. The university listed in this publication decrees that the civil authority did not originate from the people, but from God. There was no contract between ruler and subject. The tyrants did not forfeit their right to rule, that the sovereignty of the nation did not reside in Parliament, that there was no right of resistance to authority, and no right of self-preservation existed, and even that Charles I had not been lawfully resisted or executed. Religious dissent from the church was declared to be false, seditious, and impious. It was a full-blooded statement of Tory royalist monarchical doctrine. The doctrine was proclaimed as the official position of the university and was to be taught as necessary doctrine for all undergraduates and scholars. A copy of the decree was sent to London, where a delighted Charles II ordered it to be translated into English and published in the London Gazette. James could not have been more delighted. The University of Oxford had endorsed his idea of kingship and explicitly supported his succession to the throne. In horror, and to avoid rumours that he was involved in the plot, John Locke fled to Holland. James's reign began sooner than anyone expected. Charles II died without warning in January 1685, aged just 54 years. And today it's thought that he probably died from mercury poisoning, having played with mercury for some time in the laboratory in the basement of Hampton Court Palace. The new King, James, promised at his accession to defend the church, which seemed to be a good sign. And to celebrate the accession, the Corporation of Oxford gave free beer and wine to citizens from the town hall. Bonfires were lit, and celebrations went on for some time. The general election in May 1685 was one of the quietest in the century. As was usual, after the death of a monarch or after the accession of a new monarch, a general election was called. The county of Oxfordshire returned 2 MPs, Lord Falkland, who was a high Tory, and Thomas Topping, a moderate Whig. The university returned 2 firm Tories, Charles Perrott and Sir Leoline Jenkins. And despite its Whiggish reputation, the city of Oxford also returned 2 Tory MPs, Henry Bertie, the son of Lord Abingdon, and George Pudsey, who was described as a sycophant Tory. Even Woodstock, which was a notoriously turbulent borough in electoral terms, returned 2 compliant Tories. In other words, Oxfordshire seemed firmly in the Tory royalist fold. The Monmouth Rebellion in the summer of 1685 provided another opportunity for the county and the university to emphasise their support for James. Once Monmouth had landed in Devon, a recruiting drive began for troops to support the king. On the 16th of June, the Earl of Abingdon, as Lord Lieutenant of Oxfordshire, was ordered to bring the county militia to a state of readiness, and 3 days later he was ordered to send his cavalry to Reading to act as a barrier for London. The foot soldiers were to remain near Oxford. To encourage local men to enlist in the militia, it was announced that any leaseholder would have automatic renewal of their leases if they enrolled. Lord Abingdon, who remained in Oxford, was ordered to secure any people inclined to support Monmouth, especially dissenters and any who had supported Parliament in the civil wars. Oxford Jail was said to have filled alarmingly. With the county militia away from the city, Bishop John Fell of Oxford proposed that a city and university force should be raised to defend the city. A force of 800 scholars was formed into 2 troops of horse and 6 of foot. Convocation approved what it called a regiment of scholars, and a week later it was ready to defend the city. Bishop Fell begged for arms from the royal arsenal at Windsor, and drilling and marching were practiced in the streets. The quadrangle of All Souls was used as a practice yard. The only engagement of the Oxford militia was after the Battle of Sedgemoor, when the rebels fled eastward. This was probably just as well, as there was no provision of matches to light their matchlocks, which meant that their weapons were largely useless. The university militia scoured South and West Oxfordshire for any traitors trying to make their escape. By the 9th of July, the forces were ordered to stand down as the emergency was past. James expressed his great satisfaction at the response of the university and the county. Later that month, Nathaniel Boys, a fellow of University College, preached a sermon of thanksgiving for the defeat of Monmouth. Lord Abingdon celebrated his successful organisation of the militia at a grand feast at Rycott, and Oxford returned to peace and quiet. But there were disquieting developments. Lord Abingdon attracted the king's disapproval for his dislike of James's desire to sentence Titus Oates to be whipped to death. On the anniversary of the Gunpowder Plot, the 5th of November, a famously anti-Catholic celebration, James banned all bonfires. In Oxford, the citizens responded by placing lighted candles in their windows to celebrate the discovery of the plot. In 1686, Henry Compton, the Bishop of London, was suspended from his diocese for failing to stamp out anti-Catholic preaching. Compton was well liked in Oxford, having been an undergraduate and then a fellow at Queen's College, and later Bishop of Oxford. Then James began to support Catholics as heads of colleges. In 1685, Obadiah Walker, the master of University College, declared himself a Catholic and opened a new chapel in the college. James gave him a dispensation from the Test Act, which required him to be an Anglican. Walker was soon plotting with Catholic priests to begin mass conversions among students and tutors. Among them was the preacher Nathaniel Boys. Each of the convert dons was granted a dispensation by the king from any laws or university rules which prevented them from remaining fellows. Walker also set up a printing press in Oxford, which churned out Catholic tracts. Gradually, he became so unpopular in the city that he had to be accompanied by bodyguards. James also appointed the 27-year-old John Massey as Dean of Christ Church. Massey was also a Catholic and had been active in the militia during the Monmouth Rebellion. Oxford was scandalised both by his youth and his religion. The undergraduates, students, and canons of Christ Church treated Massey with insolence and insubordination. Worse still, when John Fell died, James appointed Samuel Parker as Bishop of Oxford. Parker was a Tory high churchman sympathetic to Catholicism and thought by many to be likely to be another convert in due course. The historian Steve Pincus called this campaign process of Catholicizing Oxford. The effect began only slowly, with, by one account, 4 scholars forming the Catholic congregation. James's greatest effort, as is widely documented, was his attempt to install a Catholic president of Magdalen College. In April 1687, ignoring the college statutes, James appointed Anthony Farmer to the vacant presidency. It was a poor choice. Farmer was a Cambridge man with no connections with Magdalen and was a suspected Catholic. Moreover, the appointment violated the statutes of the college, though, of course, James claimed that he had the royal power to dispense with any laws at will. James's choice of Farmer was a bad mistake. He was known in Oxford to be a drunkard, womanizer, and, quote, had been known to make women dance naked before him. The fellows refused to elect Farmer, and in the end he withdrew from the contest. But at the end of the month, James appointed Bishop Samuel Parker in his place. Parker was no more acceptable to the fellows than Farmer. Again, the fellows refused to elect him, this time with the backing of the college visitor, Bishop Muse of Winchester. And here is Muse wearing his famous beauty spot, which covered an injury incurred during the Civil War. The recalcitrant fellows were prosecuted in the Ecclesiastical Commission, where they claimed that the statutes of the college enabled them to make their own election. John Howe, who the fellows chose as their president, commented that, quote, the papists have already got Christ Church and University College. The present struggle is for Magdalen, and they threaten that in a short time they will have the rest, unquote. Howe said that he wanted the world to know that they had taken Magdalen and not that the fellows had given it up. The historian Geoffrey Wigglesworth likened the ejection of the fellows to James's determination to break a wild horse. Nevertheless, some bishops made a point of giving parishes in their dioceses to the ejected fellows, and when Samuel Parker died in 1688, there was even more shocking news. James named the Catholic bishop Bonaventure Gifford as the new president of the college. When the Earl of Abingdon gave shelter to some of the ejected fellows, he was summarily dismissed as Lord Lieutenant, to the shock of the county families. His successor, the Earl of Lichfield, was told that his appointment as Lord Lieutenant was only during the King's pleasure. News of the treatment of the Fellows of Magdalen even reached Holland, where William of Orange was told that it had inflamed the clergy against the king. James only visited Oxfordshire once in his reign, in September 1687, on his way back from North Wales, where he was praying at the will of St Winifred for his wife's fertility. He stayed first in Banbury and then received loyal addresses in Woodstock and later in Wallingford. The events in Oxfordshire didn't help James's temper. In Banbury, a mastiff ran at his horse and James shot it with a pistol. The shot caused Lord Abingdon's horse to throw him and he was badly injured. In Oxford, there were elaborate ceremonials and crowds of people, but they were largely silent and there were none of the usual cries of vivat. James's demeanour in Oxford was sullen and irritable. And here's a 1907 depiction of James in Oxford in 1687 from the Oxford Pageant postcard series. The senior proctor urged the king to be good to the Church of England and was met with a sullen royal asylum. James only became vocal when he upbraided the Fellows of Magdalen, and in private with the Vice-Chancellor, Gilbert Ironside, James complained of too much printing in Oxford, which attacked Catholics. The attempt to intrude heads of colleges was shocking enough, but in 1687, Lord Peters, a Catholic ally of James and a cousin of his Jesuit confessor, saw an opportunity to press Catholicism into Oxford even further. He claimed that large endowments of land in Cornwall and Hampshire, given by his family to Exeter College in the 16th century before the Reformation, should have been devoted to the funding of Catholic education. The Petrian Foundation at Exeter was responsible for a large share of the college's income and paid the stipends of a number of fellows. Lord Peters demanded the return of the endowments, as they'd not been used as his ancestors had intended. The case was to be heard not in court, but by the Ecclesiastical Commission, which was James's mechanism for achieving his objectives. The attack on Exeter sent a shudder through the university. Such action could mean that many pre-Reformation endowments were vulnerable. There were also rumours denied by the king's allies that he intended to take back the so-called abbey lands, that is, land which had been sold by Henry VIII at the dissolution of the monasteries. In the winter of 1687-8, a majority of the Oxfordshire gentry expressed only lukewarm support for the king when he asked them to back his policies. The occasion was what was called the Three Questions Canvass, in which in each county the king required the Lord Lieutenants to put questions to magistrates, deputy lieutenant, militia officers, and parliamentary candidates regarding their support for the king's policies. The gentlemen were by no means unanimous. Sir Rowland Lacy of Pudlicut, Lord Wenham of Thame, Sir William Walter of Sarsden, and others flatly refused to support the king. Sir Thomas Clayton and Lord Abingdon were more representative in saying that they supported religious freedom, but could never support the repeal of the Test Act. One deputy lieutenant, Sir Fairmeadow Penistone, whose family had supplied high sheriffs and deputy lieutenants of Oxfordshire for a century, said that he was loyal to the king, but couldn't support his policies without some safeguard for the church. 57% of the county gentry expressed loyalty to the king, but were only very reluctantly willing to support his Catholic policies. Moreover, a large number of absentee gentry from the meeting in Oxfordshire suggests that many of these would not have supported the king. The canvass came hard on the heels of the 1687 meeting of the Assizes, at which the judge on the Oxford circuit, Sir Thomas Rotherham, acting for the king, lambasted the Anglican clergy for their laziness and greed. The gentry were offended by the remarks, and when they were published, the gentlemen of the county stayed away from the Assizes as it circulated. At some meetings, only the High Sheriff and his two sons attended the formal opening of the Assizes, to the embarrassment of both Rotherham and the Sheriff. The Tory landowner Lord Lovelace continued to annoy the king. In February 1688, he was summoned to appear before the Privy Council for responding to a writ signed by a Catholic magistrate by saying he would wipe his backside with it. His mother tried to intercede with the king, but she was dismissed by James, who said that he could not overlook her son's disaffection to him. From that point on, Lovelace was on James's list of those to be rounded up in the future. In the spring of 1688, James began a national campaign to remove charters from towns. Revised charters would ensure that they would elect MPs sympathetic to James's policies by narrowing the franchise. James did this through the use of a writ of quo warranto, which initiated legal proceedings. Charles II had already reissued the Oxford Charter in 1684, which gave the king the right to remove elected corporation members at will. So James's new move threatened to go even further. He viewed the Corporation of Oxford as beyond redemption. At the start of 1688, he had already removed 2 aldermen and 29 council members from the corporation and tried to force the election of a clerk of his choice. The attempt to force the election of a clerk of the corporation in Oxford was captured in this painting by Egbert van Hermskirch, and this item is in the Oxfordshire Museum's service collection, and captures the moment when the corporation members simply refused to accept James's nominee. The refusal of the corporation led to the removal of its charter without even granting a new one at all. Instead, the town was to be governed by royal commissioners, who were principally Catholics. In May 1688, when James ordered his second declaration of indulgence to be read in all churches by order of the bishops, this was widely disobeyed. Not a single member of the clergy read the declaration as required in the city of Oxford. In the county of Oxfordshire, it was estimated that only 6 clergy read the declaration. When, in July, church wardens were called on to inform the king of those clergy who had defied the order, most simply didn't comply. In June 1688, as James was putting the 7 bishops who also refused to cooperate with the declaration on trial, his son, Prince James Edward, was born, and here is a French contemporary print of the birth. For James, it was a great moment. Until that point, Protestants could hope that in due course, James's daughters, Mary and Anne, both of whom were Anglican, would succeed, and James's reign would be a temporary crisis. But the birth of a Catholic male heir meant his policies would continue. In Oxford, the initial response to the news was not the celebrations that James expected. Indeed, the city was silent. With the encouragement from some troops and coinciding with the news of the acquittal of the 7 bishops, bonfires were eventually lit at Carfax and celebrations were held. But the college bells, apart from Christ Church and Magdalen, were silent. Nevertheless, James made it clear that he expected the university to produce the usual volume of verse published on great royal occasions. In the end, poor old Gilbert Ironside, the reluctant vice-chancellor, who was becoming increasingly anxious about James's plans for Oxford, arm-twisted a group of 90 or so academics and undergraduates to produce some verse, which was published as Strene Natalitia. The volume included many formulaic expressions of delight at the birth of the heir, but some of the contributors, like William Dawes, referred to the popular mood. He claimed that changed is the people's face following the birth, a nicely ambiguous phrase. The chaplain of New College, Abram Symonds, in asserting that the birth would cause clouds to be dispersed by this new rising sun, wrote that the occasion would not bring forth any feigned smiles or Judas kiss. It was a phrase that might have raised in readers' minds why such views were necessary. Symonds also commented that the child was an undoubted offspring, also acknowledging the popular awareness of the warming pan rumour that Prince James Edward was a changeling. Anthony Whistler, a young fellow of Wadham College, praised Charles II for being a kind king, whereas he described James as a stout king. In the closing lines, he pointed out the religious implications of the birth. May Thames and Tiber join their nymphs to sing, our faith's defender and our king. In a notably Protestant country, the references to Thames and Tiber might have been designed to raise concerns. Similarly, religion was the theme of the poem by Walter Roberts, The Fellow of Jesus, which referred to the prince as Albion's happiness, having Rome's outdone. At the same time that Strene Natalitia was printed, Ironside decided that he would not permit Catholics to matriculate, and any existing scholars who converted were denied the right to wear a gown. At the end of June, the long-feared axe fell. James sent a writ of quo warranto to challenge the university's own charter. The trumped-up reason for the case was that the King's printer claimed that the University of Oxford infringed his rights by publishing books. Ironside formed an alliance with Lord Clarendon and even Lord Chancellor Jeffreys to prevent the case coming to court. But it seemed likely that the outcome would be a new charter that would severely restrict the university's powers. Worse still, in July, the Duke of Ormond, the Chancellor of the university, died. The Duke had quietly supported the university against the King, and his death removed a powerful shield. 3 days after his death, convocation rushed through the election of his grandson, the new Duke, as Chancellor, before James could intrude a Catholic nominee. The King was furious and told the young Duke to refuse it, but increasingly preoccupied by rumours of William of Orange's planned invasion, James eventually backed down and allowed Ormond to remain Chancellor. At this point, Lord Lovelace fled to Holland to support the invasion preparations of William of Orange. The evidence of preparation of an invasion fleet assembled in Holland was enough to scare James, and he reversed his policies with all the style of a handbrake turn. The Fellows of Magdalen were reinstated at the end of September. A fortnight later, Bishop Muse, the visitor of Magdalen, who had supported the Fellows throughout, entered Oxford, accompanied by a large following of the county gentry, and was welcomed as a conquering hero. The landing of William of Orange stimulated a rash of fierce anti-Catholic sermons across Oxfordshire, and bonfires of celebration were lit. In his formal statement explaining why he had invaded, William of Orange recited his desire to defend Protestantism, and he included reference to the King's evil counsellors who had persuaded him to turn out the Fellows of Magdalen. James called for volunteers to respond to the invasion threat, as had happened in the Monmouth Rebellion, but this met with no response. Anthony Wood noted that, to the contrary, there was a flow of people from Oxford to William's camp. On the 25th of November, Leopold Finch, the Warden of All Souls, met William of Orange at Sherborne and assured him that all the heads of colleges, other than Massey and Walker, would declare in his favour. Soon after, Lord Abingdon also joined William. He was the first peer to do so. William moved north to Hungerford. A few days later, Captain Henry Bertie, the son of Lord Abingdon, rode into Gloucester to release Lord Lovelace, who'd been captured by James's forces. Abingdon and Lovelace were both Oxfordshire magnates and fierce rivals for control of the county, but they were united in their desire to end James's reign. By early December, William had advanced north to Abingdon with the aim of establishing his headquarters in Oxford to plan a military engagement with James. In fact, Queen Mary's flight to France with the baby prince and James's headlong retreat from Salisbury meant that William could move on to Wallingford and then Henley without entering the city of Oxford. From there, William received representations from the lords and gentry when James fled from London and agreed to assume the reins of government. In James's absence, meanwhile, the Oxford city was in rapture when Captain Bertie and Lord Lovelace entered the city with the militia, which had also turned itself over to William. The imminent defeat of James was greeted with unrest. A crowd of about 200 people smashed the windows of every known Catholic in Oxford, starting with the owner of the Mitre, who had condemned William's invasion. There were also false alarms of Irish Catholic troops coming to James's aid. These rumours were sufficient to lead to the arming of the citizens, closing entries to the city and even patrolling roads approaching Oxford. Once William and Mary were crowned as joint monarchs in April 1689, the event was marked with great celebrations in Oxford, bonfires, ringing of bells, and the usual supply of free beer and wine. The city charter was restored, and the acts of James were all reversed. The storm had passed. The role of Oxford and Oxfordshire in the reign of James II was to act as a bellwether for the country as a whole. James believed that the University of Oxford and the Tory county were loyal to the monarchy and would therefore comply absolutely with his policies. In fact, the loyalty of the county and the university to the monarch was born of their staunch Anglicanism, and in a straight contest between their king and their church, the latter won. James also had a talent for offending his strongest supporters and allies, taking for granted their commitment to his absolutist form of Stuart monarchy. In this, he made an error that cost him the throne. James was able to unite his opponents in a way never thought possible. That the families of Lord Abingdon and Lord Lovelace would act together, given their history of enmity and hostility, shows the truth of John Walsh's dictum that everyone was a Whig in 1688. However much those alliances fell apart in the years that followed, for a moment there was unity against a tyrant king. In Oxford, the reign of James ended the violence and hostility between the city and the university. Before that, tensions between town and gown had often led to violence and unrest. But after 1689, though there remained friction, the reign of James had shown that they shared a common interest against outside forces. Finally, the role of Oxford and Oxfordshire in the reign of James II says something important about the interrelationship between local and national history. It demonstrates that all history is, in a sense, local history. In the case of James, the opposition to his national policies was stimulated directly at the local level, and the revolution of 1688 was as much a popular revolt as a foreign invasion.